I completed a series last week that we've been in for some time on the mysteries of the New Testament. And I want to do a little brief series over the next 3 Sundays today and 2 more Sundays that I'm entitled The Realms of the Crucified Life. 2024 was, for the people of Evergreen, declared to be the year of the crucified life, which is simply a way of saying that everything that we've done this year has been an attempt to put on display what the life of following Jesus Christ looks like. And so beginning today and the next 2 Sundays, I want us to look at the realms, or if you will, concentric circles of where we live that crucified life and how it plays out in real practical ways. This morning, I want to look at what I've called a strategic view of marriage, because we're going to go to the 3rd chapter of Colossians today, and Paul is going to outline what that crucified life looks like. But then he's going to immediately go from a discussion of the crucified life, he's going to immediately jump into a conversation about marriage. Because that's not an accidental or coincidental transition, because Paul understood that the primary place for the crucified life to be lived out is in the home. It's in the marriage relationship. When Christians have a compartmentalized life, they are walking a really dangerous road, because the idea that I can have my church self, and that's different from my work self, and that's different from my home self, that is a broken view of what God means for the life that we've been called to live. We are to be the same people consistently living a Christ-following life in all of the aspects, all of the arenas, if you will, in which we do our life. And so today I want us to look at a strategic view of marriage, what it means to live the crucified life in relationship with another person. Next week, we're going to look at a strategic view of children and talk about what that means to live the crucified life in the context of parent to child, grandparent to grandchild, teacher to student, whoever has a relationship with raising up the next generation in the faith. There is a strategic way that we look at that, because that's a realm of the crucified life. And then 2 weeks from today, we're going to kick off the new church year with a strategic view of the church, which is the way that we live out the Christian life in a community of believers who are striving to live this life alongside of us. And for all of our shortcomings, for all of our flaws, the reality is we really are better together than we are apart. So we're going to look at the crucified life played out in these realms or arenas over the next 3 weeks. This morning I want to go to the 3rd chapter of Colossians, but I want to mention, as we go to Colossians 3, I want to mention some background from 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is a book that a letter that Paul wrote to what is hands down the most disastrous church that we know about in the 1st century. I mean, the Corinthian church was a hot mess. They were followers of Jesus, but they had taken a syncretistic approach to their paganism that they were coming out of, and they had baptized a lot of their pagan practices, and frankly, they weren't as distinctive from the world around them as Paul wanted them to be. In fact, this church, if you read 1 Corinthians, what you find is essentially a laundry list of problems that Paul has to deal with. This is a church marked by spiritual immaturity, pridefulness, immorality, including incest in the church. There was the abuse of spiritual gifts. There was the abuse of the Lord's Supper, syncretism with idolatry. They practiced an embarrassing and unseemly worship style. And yet, with all of that laundry list of issues that Paul had to deal with, when you read 1 Corinthians chapter 1, it's a bit surprising, but the problem that he starts with, job 1, the issue that had to be dealt with before all of these other theological problems, chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, Paul says, I hear that there are factions and divisions among you. This should not be. And he begins his correction of the church by taking them to the very essence of what it meant to be a church, to be in fellowship, to be in relationship with other believers. And he shows that the crucified life is not lived in isolation and it's not lived in competition. It's lived in the context of a community of other believers who are all striving to follow Jesus and to be like him. Now, we're going to see Paul follow that up in Colossians by talking about the do's and the don'ts of the Christian life. But it's not simply a list of do's and don'ts. These are character qualities that Paul wants us to understand. Some things we intentionally put away from ourselves. Other things we intentionally, like clothing, put on ourselves. And then he's going to take us to the marriage relationship and say, okay, now that you understand what the crucified life looks like, let's talk about how it plays out in this most basic of human relationships, husband and wife. All right? Colossians chapter 3. We're not going to look at the early part of the chapter, but in the early verses of chapter 3, Paul gives us the negatives. He talks about the things in the Christian life that need to be put away. Let me just read one verse. In Colossians chapter 3, in verse 5, Paul says, therefore, meaning because we're in Christ, that comes from the early verses, therefore, treat the parts of your earthly body as dead to sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. In other words, he says there are some things that you need to get rid of. There are some don'ts in the Christian life. Don't practice sexual immorality. Don't do these things. Now, the problem is, for some people, the Christian life is always and only about the don'ts. Surely you've met people, because I know I have, people who define their Christianity by what they don't do. Well, how do you know you're a Christian? Well, I don't dance. Well, that's a shame, because David sure knew how to dance. Well, I don't do drugs. Well, good for you. I don't rob banks. Well, there you go. I'm glad the bar is set so high for you. When Christianity defines itself by the things we don't do, all we've done is create a sort of religious legalism that says, here are the boundaries and we can't cross these lines. Now, Paul says there are some things that I want you to not do. I want you to put these things away from you. But he doesn't leave us with essentially a negative religious view of Christianity. Because then he's going to turn around and he's going to say, okay, while you're putting away some things, I want you, like clothing, to put some things on that will define you visibly and practically as a follower of Jesus. In other words, the crucified life is not just what we don't do, it is what we are called to do as well. Now, in this chapter, we're going to start with verse 12, and this is where Paul turns his attention to the positive side, the do list, if you will. But he wants us to see, essentially, as we work through this list, I've given you this point, he wants us to see that love is a spiritual weapon. Now, in our generation, love is a word that is used sentimentally. It's a mushy kind of feeling. The biblical take on love is never about butterflies in the stomach and sort of inflamed passions of physical attraction. The word love that is used in Scripture is not an emotion, it is an action. And so he's going to show us how love plays out and how all of these characteristics are bound together by love, so that here we see the positive virtues in contrast to that earlier list of the vices. And he wants us to understand that the transformation that comes with the crucified life involves more than just the don't do these things. It involves the do these things instead. Now, beginning in verse 12 of Colossians 3, Paul says, so, as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved. Now let's just pause right there. I know it's the middle of a sentence, but let's just pause there. He says, I want to talk to you as those who have been chosen by God, holy and beloved. What's interesting about those titles that Paul uses is if we go back to the Old Testament in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and again in Deuteronomy chapter 7, those words are the very words that God uses to describe Israel as his people. Chosen by God, holy and beloved. Now, it's not just Old Testament, because a few weeks from now, when I'm teaching through 1 Peter, and that's coming later in the fall, when we get to 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter's going to use this same language, and he's going to refer to the church as the holy and beloved, chosen people of God. Now, here's why that's important. Because we have in our minds, a lot of times, this idea that, in fact, I've had people say this to me in counseling situations before. They'll say, Pastor, I'm so distraught because I'm such a disappointment to God. Let's talk about that. There is in all of our heads a series of voices. You don't have to be schizophrenic to have conversations in your head. There is one particular voice that usually sounds like your voice. In fact, the illusion is you're having an internal conversation with yourself. Only here's the problem. That voice has a pretty low opinion of you. That's the voice that you hear in your head that says, I'm really not very good at this Christianity thing. That's the voice that says, I can't do anything at the church because I'm just not good at this. I'm a disappointment to God. The title that Paul uses here, that Peter uses later, that Moses used in the Old Testament, tells us something about the way God views his people. He says that we are chosen by him. In other words, if you're a follower of Jesus, an actual follower, you've been adopted by the Spirit of God into the family. That adoption is a choice. There's a powerful image throughout the New Testament when Paul uses the image of God adopting us. We talk about a new birth, and that's the emphasis of the new birth when we talk about that is that when God does something in you, you get a new start, a fresh beginning. But when Paul talks about salvation, he loves to use the image of adoption, because here's the thing about adoption. Adoption isn't just sort of a close your eyes and you get what you get. Adoption has the idea of looking at the options and choosing a particular child. You are not a Christian by accident, by coincidence. You didn't stumble into Christianity. God didn't turn around one day and just find you there and say, oh, here's another one, let them in. God chose you, and he calls you holy and beloved. Holy is a word that means set apart for a particular purpose, and beloved means that the action of love is constantly directed toward you. Here's the thing. I want you to be able to distinguish the voices in your head, because there is the Spirit of God. If you're a follower of Jesus, the Spirit of God will often speak to you, and he can be pretty blunt. I mean, I know I've had conversations with the Spirit of God where he was very straightforward with me. I've jokingly said that when he's trying to encourage me, he calls me Michael, but when he's correcting me, he calls me Gabbert. And he says things like, Gabbert, that's not worthy of who you are in Christ. You know better than that. But here's the thing. The Holy Spirit has the capability of correcting us. I mean, he can get in our faces sometimes and correct us. But in the process of correcting us, the Holy Spirit never wounds us. There is, though, a different voice in our heads that is very accusatory and ugly. That's the voice that says, you're terrible at this Christianity thing. If people knew the kinds of thoughts you think, they would spit in your face. You shouldn't even go to that church. In fact, if you quit going to that church, nobody would even miss you. Let me tell you something. That voice is disguised to look like it's your voice and you feel like you're talking to yourself, but let me tell you who it is. That voice that's telling you how bad you are, how worthless you are, how pointless your efforts are, that voice is the person that the Bible calls the accuser of the brothers. And his constant task is to try and beat you up so that you, out of despair for yourself, just sort of take yourself voluntarily out of the game. He says, God is so disappointed in you. Man, you sin and you ask for forgiveness and God forgives you, and then you cycle back around and you do that same thing over again. You're terrible at this. Listen, that's the enemy who's whispering in your ear. The fact of the matter is, you are holy, set apart for a purpose, and you're beloved by God, chosen intentionally by Him. You're never going to be a disappointment to God. You say, well, I do things that have to be a disappointment to, well, they may disappoint us because we like to think we're better than we actually are. So I can disappoint myself, but God looks at me and He says, listen, you're still a work in process. But remember, I promised you that I would be the author and the finisher of your faith. I would be the beginning and the end. I would bring you to completion. One of these days, you're going to see Jesus as He is because I'm going to make sure that you're like Him. Folks, don't let the enemy get inside your head and play you with his lies. All you need to remember is I am chosen by God, holy and beloved by Him. Don't ever concede that title that was intended specifically for you. Well, look at verse 12. Paul says, so as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion and kindness. Here we go. If love is a spiritual weapon, he starts by saying, you've taken off some things. Now I want you to put on some things. And I want you to start with compassion and kindness. Compassion is the heartfelt sympathy for those who are suffering or in need. It's the idea of seeing that I'm not the center of the universe. And compassion is the attitude that looks outside of myself and realizes that there are people around me and they have struggles and they have needs in their life. And my compassion is that I feel an ache on their behalf because of what they're going through. Now, here's the thing. The concrete expression of compassion is kindness. Kindness is a friendly and helpful spirit which meets the needs of others through my good deeds. In other words, compassion is when I get outside of myself, when I quit seeing myself as the center of the universe, and I realize that other people are going through issues. And when I realize that, when I have compassion on them, then kindness is the tangible way that I step into their world to try and help as best I can. Now, this is important that compassion and kindness go together, that the sense of other people's hurt is coupled with my intentional involvement in order to help their situation. See, this is why James, in the book of James, is so explicit when he says, listen, it's not okay for you to see somebody else's need and then just with real piety go, well, be warm, be filled. He goes, it doesn't do any good to just say nice things. He tells us your faith, if you don't have works that attach to it, if you don't have a practical expression, then your words are just a lot of hot air. That's what Paul's telling us here. He's saying, I want you to put away some things on the Christian life, but I want you to put on something. And one of the things I want you to put on is compassion, which is being aware of people outside of my bubble. I'm not the center of the universe. There are other people going through things, and I need to be aware of their struggles. And then kindness is my tangible expression of stepping into their story and helping in practical ways as best I can. Compassion and kindness. But then he says, put on humility and gentleness. Humility and gentleness. Humility is the proper estimation of oneself. It is not self-abasement or self-criticism. We have this misunderstanding about humility. We think humility means that you sort of just shuffle your feet, kind of an aw shucks attitude. And when somebody says something nice to you, doesn't it irritate you when you give somebody a compliment and they don't know how to take it? They're like, oh, shucks, I'm nothing. You know what happens when somebody compliments you? And because you think that being humble means that you don't accept it and you sort of deflect it, what you're actually doing is you're insulting the God who created you. You see, humility is not shooting myself as in the foot because I'm unimportant. Humility is the proper understanding of where I fit in the order of things. Let me give you an example. I have the spiritual gift of teaching. That means that my particular contribution to the church is primarily in the area of teaching. Now, one of the things that happens to me occasionally is somebody comes up to me and they'll say, oh, Pastor, that sermon was awesome. I think it's happened twice. But when somebody comes and gives me a compliment about my teaching, there are two wrong responses and one right response. The first wrong response is, yeah, I'm pretty good at this. I'm glad you finally recognized that I'm that guy. Wrong response. That's called pride. But see, there's another wrong response, and this is what we tend to default to because we think it's humility. The wrong response would be to sort of shuffle my feet and go, oh, shucks, I'm not that good. I wasn't really that good. Listen, here's the thing. For me to act that way is to suggest that God didn't give me a gift to be used in the church. That if anything that I do is good, then it's sort of a happy accident for all of us. No, the fact is, if I preach a bad sermon, then that's on me. But if I preach a good sermon, it's because the Spirit of God has gifted me to be able to do that. So there are two wrong answers. Boy, I'm really something, and I'm glad you finally noticed. And, oh, I'm nothing, and really, I'm not comfortable with your compliment. The proper response is to say something along the lines of, listen, I appreciate you saying that. Be sure and thank God because he gets all the glory for this. If the sermon was good, it's because the Spirit of God showed up and decided to teach, and he just happened to use me that day to teach through. Do you see what I'm saying? Humility, when Paul says, I want you to put on humility, he's not saying, I want you to have a low view of yourself. He's saying, I want you to have a proper view of yourself. I want you to understand who you are in Jesus Christ. You are somebody in Christ, but the credit for you being somebody goes to Christ all the time. So humility is recognizing that we can do good things. We can actually be pretty good at some of the things that we do, but we are good at the things that we do because God has empowered us to do that, so he gets the credit. Humility is not, don't embarrass yourself with, it's really false humility. When we go, oh, thanks, but I'm nothing. No. Remember, you're chosen by God, holy, that is, set apart for a purpose, and beloved. Don't downplay who you are in Christ. Humility is not a low opinion of yourself, it's a proper opinion of yourself. But humility is always paired with gentleness. That is, gentleness is a freedom from pride and self-centeredness. Gentleness is power under control. Actually, the Greek word refers to a wild horse, and we use the language of taming or breaking the horse. When a wild horse is tamed, he doesn't lose any of his strength, he doesn't lose any of his speed, he doesn't lose any of his forcefulness, but he does bring all of that under the guidance of the rider who shows how he can make use of it. Gentleness doesn't mean we're wimps. It doesn't mean we're doormats. It doesn't mean we let people walk all over us. Gentleness means that in the power that we have as men and women who serve Jesus Christ, empowered by his Spirit, we take that power and we submit it to the leadership of the Spirit so that we act in a way that that power is always under control. Compassion goes with kindness. Humility is paired with gentleness. And then Paul says, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so you must do also. Patience and forgiveness go together. Patience in the Christian life is the capacity to bear injustice or injury without revenge or retaliation. In other words, patience is what allows us to not simply settle into kind of a quiet resignation when people hurt us, but to proactively forgive those grievances that come from other people. Now, we need to understand what forgiveness really is, because I've had conversations over the years with people who have been hurt in pretty dramatic ways. People who have been abused or whatever. And they'll say things to me like, I just can't forgive that person because I can't say what they did to me is okay. All right, I'm with you 100%. But you have a misunderstanding of what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is not saying that what they did to you is okay. Forgiveness instead is simply saying, I relinquish my claim on that person's judgment or punishment, and I leave it in the hands of God. You see, God is very clear in the book of Hebrews. He says, you remember he says, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Sometimes I wonder if we get frustrated because we don't see people that hurt us sort of getting their just desserts. And I wonder if God is saying, I'm ready to take care of this situation. I'm ready to correct and judge. I'm ready to do what needs to happen. But you haven't relinquished your claim on their judgment. And as long as their judgment is in your hands, I'm not going to do anything. You see, I talked to someone years ago who had been in a very abusive situation growing up. And the comment was, I just can't forgive that person because I can't say what they did is right. I said, I get that. And I'm not suggesting that you say what they did is right, because it wasn't right and it will never be right. But think about this. Do you think that person from years ago, you think they're waking up in the middle of the night and thinking about you? No. You're not even on their radar. You're not even in their thought processes anywhere along the way. You know who is waking up in the middle of the night stewing about this? You. Why? Because that person and their sin, their hurt against you, is living rent-free in your head. And what happens is, by not forgiving, you have laid claim to their judgment. And what happens is, unforgiveness eventually becomes bitterness. Do you know what bitterness is? It's the only poison that we drink that we hope will hurt the other person. Forgiveness is not saying that what somebody did to us is okay. Forgiveness is saying, Lord, I relinquish my right to judgment and I leave it in your hands. And folks, by faith, you have to trust nobody gets away with sin. Nobody walks scot-free. God doesn't wink at sin and go, well, it wasn't that bad. Listen, sin is sin. But as long as we claim judgment, we can't forgive. Forgiveness is not saying it was okay. Forgiveness is saying, I'm not the judge. I'm going to leave it to the judge. Forgiveness and patience go together, because patience is the ability to bear injury without it turning into bitterness. And forgiveness is the way that we settle this once and for all. We relinquish our claim in a particular situation and leave it in God's hands. And the reason we do this, Paul's very clear here at the end of verse 13. He says, just as the Lord forgave you, you must do also. The forgiven are obligated to become forgivers. Listen, do you think when Jesus forgave you, that he just looked at you and he tallied up everything that you'd ever done and he said, they're really a pretty good person overall. I'll just write this off. It'll be fine. They're not too bad. We'll just throw away the list. No. I don't care if you were the best sinner that ever lived on earth. If you had one sin, it separated you from God, and there was only one way to pay for that sin. Somebody had to bear the brunt of the punishment, the wrath that was due that sin. And Jesus didn't say, I'll wink at this, I'll throw away their list. He said, I'll take it on myself, and I'll pay the penalty, and I'll pay the price, and I'll satisfy their sin. You and I have been forgiven because somebody else took the punishment. We are now obligated to put on a spirit of forgiveness as we forgive others. Now, listen, forgiving people that are not believers, sometimes that's difficult but we have to trust that God is the one who judges when the time is right. But also within the church family, within our biological families, we have to be a people of forgiveness. Nothing will do damage in a church like the church in Corinth. Nothing will do damage in a church more than divisions where people sit on this side of the room or they sit on that side of the room because they're at odds with each other. That is not the life that he tells us to put on like clothing. Compassion and kindness, humility and gentleness, patience and forgiveness. But then he says in verse 14, in addition to all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. Unifying love is the character trait that ties all the rest of the Christian life together. When love is present, there is harmony and unity in the community of faith. It fashions the virtues into spiritual clothing, and it binds believers together in a kind of mature oneness as the people of God. All of these traits of the Christian life are connected to relationships because Christianity is community. American Christianity is a problem when we try and turn Christianity into a solo endeavor that we do on our own. I despise that bumper sticker theology that says, just Jesus and me. No, I'm sorry. It's not just Jesus and you. It's you walking with Jesus in the context of a community of faith, of other people walking alongside you with Jesus as well. All of these traits mark us. Now, that's the Christian life. Put away some things, put on some other things instead, and then he's going to take us to the place where we understand that love is not just a spiritual weapon, it's also a practical reality. And he's going to start in the context of the marriage relationship. Verse 18 and 19. Love is a practical reality. First of all, he's going to give us what I've called a high standard. Verse 18. Paul says, wives, be subject to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Now, you may have a translation on your lap that says, wives, submit to your husbands. Listen, maybe more than any other verse in the whole Bible, this is the verse that makes our culture lose its ever-loving mind. Wives, be subject, or wives, submit to your husbands. The problem is, when we criticize this verse and we say, well, Christianity is patriarchal and it's oppressive and it's anti-woman, it's interesting that Christianity is accused of being anti-woman in a culture like ours that says it's okay for biological men to beat up women in the boxing ring at the Olympics. We're not anti-women. We're the ones defending women. We actually can define what is a woman. When Paul says, wives, be subject to your husbands, first of all, he's simply saying, recognize that there is a God-designed structure for the home and fit in that structure. Listen, a wide receiver is not inferior or less significant to a football team than the quarterback. But when they get together in the huddle and the quarterback calls a play, when they break the huddle and go to the line, there are 10 other people besides the quarterback who are expected to run a particular route, a blocking route, a pass route. They're supposed to do their part because they're a part of a team, and this is the plan. The quarterback, if everybody just stands up when they hike the ball, the quarterback is in a bad shape. He needs the blockers. He needs the receivers. But if they just run around any way they want to, chances are nobody's going to catch a ball or score any points because the quarterback has no idea what's happening. What happens on a team? The team that has a plan and they execute the plan according to its design, that's the team that advances the ball and scores points. When God designed the family, He put a husband and wife in a relationship and designed it in a way so that they would work together as a team. A wife is not inferior to a husband is not superior to a wife, but they have different roles to play within the relationship as God designs it. Now, having said that, we have this statement that Paul makes where he says, wives, be subject to your husbands. That's where our culture ends the verse. But the rest of the verse says, as is fitting in the Lord. In other words, wives, follow the leadership of your husband, but Jesus Christ is the model for that. Well, how is he a model? Well, when Jesus came and was born as a baby in Bethlehem, the Bible tells us that he made some decisions when he came and took on human flesh. The book of Philippians tells us that Jesus emptied himself of certain divine prerogatives. That is, the things that he had a natural claim to because he was God, he laid them aside. For example, when Jesus was here on earth, he laid aside his omniscience. He didn't know everything that was happening everywhere all the time. He self-limited his omniscience while he was on earth. By the same token, he laid aside his omnipotence. That is, Jesus did miracles, but he always did miracles in the power of the Father flowing through him. Jesus on earth didn't have unlimited power to do anything that he wanted anywhere on earth all at the same time. He self-limited himself. In other words, he put himself under the authority of the Father. Now get this. Was Jesus inferior to the Father? No, never for 1 minute were the Father and the Son in competition or in subjection. It was a functional reality of submitting for the purpose of the incarnation and bringing redemption into the world. In other words, what we're saying here is when a wife is submissive to her husband, it is not because she's inferior. It's not because she has no equality in the relationship. It's not because she makes no contribution to the family. It's because, like Christ, it's for a time, for a season, in order to accomplish something that God has designed. It is a high standard that is held up for women to live up to. You say, well, Pastor, you don't know my husband. No, I don't. But I do know that Jesus said, fulfill your role in the marriage like you're serving me. Now, here's the thing. It really drives me crazy when people quote that verse like it's a mic drop moment. Well, wives, submit to your husbands. If there's a high standard in verse 18 for wives, there is a higher expectation in verse 19 for husbands. In verse 19, it says, husbands, love your wives and do not become bitter against them. First of all, the word here, love, is in the perfect tense. Here's your Greek lesson for the day. It means a continuous action. We could translate this verse, husbands, keep on loving your wife. It's not talking about feeling. It's not talking about sentiment. It means keep on practicing the aspects of the crucified life that show her that she is important to you. But then he says, I love this part. He says, and do not become bitter against them. What that means is he's telling husbands, don't treat your wife like she is a source of constant irritation to you. You ever found yourself in a season when, and this works both ways, but in a season when everything about your spouse just irritated the fire out of you? I mean, good night, the way they breathe is so loud. I mean, have you seen them cut a sandwich? They cut it crossways instead of diagonal. Who does that? Drives me crazy. When they put on a sock and then a shoe and then move to the other foot. What sociopath does that? Here's the one thing I've learned over the years. If you are at the place where everything your spouse does irritates you, 100% of the time, you're the problem. Because come on, they can't get 100% of everything wrong. That's on you. What he's saying here is, men, don't act like your wife was put in your house just to drive you crazy. In fact, when he says keep on loving them, he means, like Jesus Christ, you extend yourself as far as you need to go, all the way to death if necessary, to protect and nurture and serve her. You want your wife to submit to you? You want her to live up to the high standard of verse 18? Then men, you make sure you're living up to the higher expectation of verse 19. Your job is to make her submission to you easy for her to follow. Well, why do we do all of this? Well, the underlying motive for this life that we live and the way that we do it in marriage is in the end of the chapter, verses 23 and 24. The motive is this. He says in verse 23, whatever you do your work heartily as for the Lord and not for people, knowing that it is from the Lord that you will receive the reward of the inheritance. When you live the married life as a realm of the crucified life, the reason that you serve your spouse is because living the Christian life in your home is an act of devotion to Jesus Christ. So here's your homework for the week. This is going to be real hard for some of you, but I want to challenge you to do this. If you're married, find a time this week where you can sit down, the two of you, and you can say this: are we living the crucified life correctly together in a way that strengthens our marriage in all that we do? Now, when you start that conversation, this is not permission to pull out that list that you've been keeping. This is not an inventory of all the things that you want changed. This is a fundamental analysis that says we cannot live a healthy married life unless we are both pursuing the crucified life of Jesus. And as we both pursue the crucified life of Jesus, we're supposed to pursue it by helping each other live that life. So if we want a healthy married life, is the life of the crucified life that we're sharing, are we doing that well? How can we strengthen each other in our pursuit of Jesus Christ? Because let me tell you, before we get to our children, before we get to the church, before we get to the culture around us, if you don't know how to be a Christian and live this crucified life in the context of your marriage, there's really not much else that you can do after that. That's why the enemy attacks the home so viciously. We will never change our nation. We will never change our culture. We will never have great influence out there if we don't figure out how to live the crucified life in the bond of a husband and a wife following Jesus arm in arm together. Let this be a moment where you sit down with your spouse and say, let's just talk. How can we do this Jesus life better than we're doing it. That will improve the quality of your marriage. It'll improve the atmosphere in your home. And it will impact the way you are able to then look out into the world and begin to have compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience and forgiveness and unifying love to the rest of the family of God's people, chosen by God, holy and beloved, just like you.